White homeowner calls police on a black delivery driver, not realizing he's the mayor's son. The police sirens wailed in the quiet suburban neighborhood, a sound that brought everything to a sudden, fearful halt. A black delivery driver stood by his van, his hands raised in the air, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. The officer who had arrived on the scene was already barking orders into his radio, demanding backup. "I told you I'm just delivering a package," the driver Jeremy pleaded, his voice shaky. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." But the white homeowner, standing on his porch with a phone pressed to his ear, wasn't listening. His finger pointed accusingly at Jeremy, his voice high-pitched with anger and fear. "He doesn't belong here. He's suspicious. Get him out of here," the homeowner shouted, not realizing that the man he had just called the police on was none other than the mayor's son. Jeremy's heart raced. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had been making deliveries in this neighborhood for months, never causing any trouble. But today, everything changed. The moment he stepped onto the porch of the white homeowner, the man had looked at him with suspicion, as if he didn't belong. "Why are you doing this?" Jeremy asked, his voice cracking as the tension rose. But the homeowner only stood there, still waving his hands and shouting. Jeremy felt the cold sting of humiliation rise in his chest. He had been here before. As a black man, he had faced countless moments where he felt out of place, where people looked at him with judgment, and now this was happening again. Just as the police officer began to approach him, his phone rang. Jeremy glanced at the caller ID, the name displayed in bold letters, Mayor Thomas Williams. His heart skipped a beat. His father? He quickly answered the call, trying to hide his trembling hands. "Jeremy, what's going on? Are you okay?" Mayor Williams' voice came through the speaker, calm and steady, but with an undercurrent of concern. "Dad. I'm fine, but I'm being harassed by some guy in the neighborhood. He called the cops on me because he thinks I'm suspicious." The mayor's voice turned cold. "Did he say anything specific?" "Yeah, he said I didn't belong here, and he's freaking out because I'm delivering a package," Jeremy said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. There was a brief pause on the line. Then, his father spoke again, his tone now sharp. "Stay where you are, son. I'll take care of this." Jeremy stood frozen, waiting as the police officer approached. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but then, to his surprise, the officer stopped just short of him. The homeowner, too, seemed to hesitate for a moment. There was a long silence, filled only by the distant hum of the sirens. Then, just as quickly as the chaos had erupted, it stopped. The officer looked at the homeowner with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "This is ridiculous," the officer muttered, shaking his head. "We've been getting calls all day about deliveries. Do you really need to waste our time over something like this?" The homeowner, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, didn't know how to respond. His earlier bravado seemed to evaporate in front of the officer. But before Jeremy could say anything, he heard his father's voice again, this time over the speaker of the officer's radio. "Officer, this is Mayor Thomas Williams. I suggest you let my son go, and we can talk about this in person. Immediately." The officer's eyes widened as he looked down at the phone in his hand, realizing who he had been dealing with. He quickly lowered his gaze to Jeremy and stepped back, as if he had just realized the weight of his actions. "Of course, sir." "No problem," the officer said, his voice faltering. The homeowner's face drained of color as he realized who he had just called the police on. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jeremy stood there, staring at the man who had caused this scene. His chest was tight with anger, but there was something else too, a deep, painful sadness that had settled into his bones. "Mr. Mitchell," the officer said, turning to the homeowner, "I suggest you reconsider your actions. Next time, be more careful about who you call the police on." Without another word, the officer turned and walked back to his squad car. The homeowner was left standing on his porch, his face red with shame. Jeremy could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. This was not how he had imagined his day going. The confrontation with the homeowner had escalated so quickly, and yet in the end, it was his father's position that had saved him. Jeremy couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. It wasn't the first time his father's influence had gotten him out of trouble, but it was the first time he had felt so humiliated in front of everyone. He turned and started to walk back to his van, but the words of the homeowner echoed in his mind. "He doesn't belong here." He clenched his fists, trying to push the anger down. It was only a delivery, a simple job, yet it had turned into something so much more. Before he could even get inside the van, his phone rang again. This time, it was a text message from his father. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. We need to talk." Jeremy took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that conversation, but he knew one thing for sure: things were about to get a lot more complicated. He climbed into the van and shut the door, the engine roaring to life as he pulled away from the house. But as he drove down the quiet streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play here. Something that he couldn't fully understand just yet. And deep down, he knew this wasn't the last time he'd feel the sting of that moment. The homeowner's words would follow him, and the pain of being treated as an outsider would linger long after this day was over. As the van disappeared down the street, the quiet of the neighborhood slowly returned, but the tension was still thick in the air, a reminder of the events that had just unfolded. Jeremy drove in silence, the hum of the van's engine the only sound breaking the quiet. His mind was racing, each thought bouncing around like a pinball, too fast to grasp. He had just experienced one of the most uncomfortable, humiliating moments of his life. And the fact that his father had to step in for him, again, only made it worse. His phone buzzed in his hand, and he glanced down at the screen. It was a text from his best friend Kyle. "Yo, you good? Heard about the whole thing. You all right?" Jeremy didn't know how to respond. What could he say? That he was fine? That he was used to it? That he could brush it off? The truth was, he wasn't fine. He wasn't used to it. And he couldn't just forget about it. He typed back a short response. "I'm fine, just shaken." His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, but then he hit send. No need to get into it. Not yet. He tried to focus on the road, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the morning. That homeowner's words echoed in his mind like an insult he couldn't shake. He doesn't belong here. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that. As a black man, Jeremy had experienced his fair share of stares, whispers, and uncomfortable encounters. But this one felt different. More personal. More deliberate. And now, his father was on his way to talk to him. Jeremy wasn't sure what to expect. Was his dad going to be angry? Disappointed? Or was he going to brush it off, as if it was just another inconvenience to deal with? Jeremy didn't have much time to think about it before he pulled into his driveway. He parked the van, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, staring at the house in front of him. The home was big, too big for a man who had grown up on the tough streets of the city. It was the house that had come with his father's success, with his father's influence. Jeremy felt a sharp pang in his chest. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate what his father had done for him. It was just that he didn't always feel like he fit in. Not here, in this neighborhood of pristine lawns and perfectly manicured houses. And not even in his own life sometimes. Everything always seemed to be about his father, his reputation, his power, his ability to make things happen. But where did that leave Jeremy? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Jeremy looked up, and his father's black SUV came into view. Mayor Thomas Williams stepped out of the car, his face serious, his posture confident as always. But Jeremy could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. "Hey son," Mayor Williams said, walking up to Jeremy's van. His voice was calm, but Jeremy could sense the weight behind his words. "Dad," Jeremy said, forcing a smile. He opened the van door and stepped out, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I had to, Jeremy," his father said, his tone firm but gentle. "That situation was unacceptable. And I want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," Jeremy lied. "It was just one of those things, you know? People like him, they see me and assume things. It's not the first time." "Jeremy," his father said, his voice lowering, "this isn't something you should just brush off. It's a pattern, and it's something we need to address, both as a family and in your community." Jeremy shifted uncomfortably. He didn't want to have this conversation. He didn't want to talk about how people saw him or how his father's position made things more complicated. He wanted to forget about the whole ordeal, to move on. But his father wasn't letting him off that easy. "Did you hear what he said?" Jeremy asked, his voice thick with emotion. "He said I didn't belong there. He acted like I was some kind of criminal just because I was delivering a package." "I know," Mayor Williams said, his voice softening. "I heard. And it's wrong. But this is the reality we face. It's not just about you being the mayor's son. It's about the way people see you, see us, Because of the color of our skin. Jeremy wanted to argue, to say that his father's status shouldn't matter, that he should be treated like everyone else. But he knew his father was right. No matter how much he wanted to ignore it, the reality was that things were different for him. People saw his father's name and assumed certain things, and it wasn't always fair. I just don't understand, Dad, Jeremy said, frustration creeping into his voice. Why does it always have to be like this? Why can't I just be a delivery driver, doing my job like everyone else? His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. You don't have to understand it. But you do need to know that you have power. The power to change things, to make a difference. Jeremy shook his head. I don't know if I can make a difference. I just want to live my life without all this drama. Mayor Williams gave him a pointed look. You will make a difference. But it's not going to be easy. There are people out there who don't see you as just a delivery driver. They see you as something else. And we can't ignore that. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Jeremy felt like he was drowning in them, like he was suffocating under the weight of his father's expectations. He had never asked for any of this. He hadn't asked for the mayor's name, or the responsibility that came with it. He just wanted to be himself. Before he could say anything else, his father's phone rang. He pulled it out of his pocket and glanced at the screen. Excuse me, he said, stepping away for a moment to answer the call. I need to take this. Jeremy watched him walk toward the house, his thoughts racing. He didn't want to keep talking about it. He just wanted the day to end, for everything to go back to normal. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. Not after today. The phone call ended quickly, and Mayor Williams returned to Jeremy. His face was grim. I need to go, he said. There's something I need to handle downtown. Yeah, okay, Jeremy said quietly. He could feel the lump in his throat. He didn't want his dad to leave. He didn't want to be left alone with his thoughts. I'll check in with you later, his father said, his hand on Jeremy's shoulder one last time. We'll figure this out. Jeremy nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. He watched his father walk back to the car, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As the SUV pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, Jeremy stood there for a long moment. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had just taken a turn, and he wasn't sure he was ready for the road ahead. Jeremy sat on the porch of his father's house, staring out at the neatly trimmed lawn and the quiet street. The weight of the morning's events still pressed down on him, the words of the homeowner echoing in his mind. He doesn't belong here. It was a simple statement, but the impact was anything but. It had struck him deeper than he cared to admit. He had been sitting there for over an hour, thinking about everything, the confrontation, his father's words, his own frustration. His father had tried to reassure him that he could make a difference, that there was power in what he was experiencing. But Jeremy didn't feel powerful. He felt small. He felt invisible, like he was just another black face in a world that didn't want to acknowledge him. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, recognizing the name on the screen. It was Kyle, his best friend, the one person who always knew how to make him feel better. Yo, how's it going? You need to talk about it? Jeremy stared at the message for a moment. He didn't want to talk. Not yet. But Kyle was the one person who understood. He could talk about things without judgment, without trying to fix everything. Jeremy typed back a quick reply. Yeah. I don't know what to do anymore. The reply came quickly. You should talk to your dad. He's the mayor, man. He can do something about this. You don't have to go through this alone. Jeremy sighed, feeling the frustration build up again. I don't want to use him to fix everything. It's not about his position. It's about me, just being me. Kyle's message came through again. Yeah, but you're his son. And if anyone can make things change, it's him. Jeremy's fingers hovered over the screen as he thought about his friend's words. Kyle had a point. But it didn't feel right, asking his father to use his influence. He didn't want to be the son of the mayor. He just wanted to be a person. A person who could walk down the street without fear of being judged. The phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't Kyle. It was a number he didn't recognize. Jeremy stared at the screen for a moment, unsure if he should answer. He was still upset, still trying to process everything, but curiosity got the best of him. Hello. Jeremy answered, his voice cautious. Jeremy? It's Mitchell, came the voice on the other end. Mitchell. The homeowner. The man who had called the police on him. Jeremy felt his stomach turn at the sound of his name. What do you want? Jeremy asked, his voice sharp. There was a long pause before Mitchell spoke again. I just wanted to apologize. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just some guy causing trouble in the neighborhood. I was wrong. Jeremy was silent for a moment, his mind spinning. He wasn't sure how to respond. Should he accept the apology? Was this some kind of ploy to save face? I don't need your apology, Jeremy said finally, his voice low. You don't get to just apologize and make everything better. I understand, Mitchell replied quickly. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I want to make things right. I don't want to be that guy anymore. Jeremy closed his eyes, the anger and frustration bubbling up again. That guy. The one who saw him as a threat just because of the color of his skin. The one who assumed the worst without knowing anything about him. I don't know if you can make things right, Jeremy said, his voice barely above a whisper. You can't just erase what you did. I know, Mitchell said quietly. But I'm going to try. I promise. There was a long silence between them. Jeremy didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to hang up, to walk away from the whole situation. But another part of him felt uncertain. Was it possible to forgive someone like Mitchell? Could he really move past what had happened? You're right, Jeremy said, his voice cold. I don't need your apology. But I guess it's a start. Just, don't do this again. Don't make assumptions about people. I won't, Mitchell promised. I swear. And I'll do whatever I can to make things right. Jeremy hung up the phone, staring at it for a moment. He wasn't sure what to make of the conversation. Mitchell had apologized, but was it enough? Could an apology ever really make up for the way he had been treated? The truth was, Jeremy wasn't sure. He didn't know if he could ever forget what had happened. He didn't know if he could ever look at Mitchell the same way again. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let this go. Not yet. Not when there was still so much to be done. He stood up from the porch and walked toward the house, his thoughts still swirling. The conversation with Mitchell had only opened up more questions, more uncertainty. It hadn't given him the clarity he was hoping for. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something. As he walked inside, his phone buzzed once more. This time, it was an email. He opened it, and his stomach dropped as he read the subject line, Urgent, Mayor's Office Press Conference tomorrow. Jeremy's heart began to race. This was it. His father was going to address what had happened. He was going to make a public statement. Jeremy felt a knot form in his stomach. The last thing he wanted was to be thrust into the spotlight, to be the center of the media's attention. But now, it seemed like that was exactly where he was headed. The email contained details about the press conference and instructions for attending. Jeremy stared at the screen, his mind spinning. He didn't know if he was ready for this. He didn't know if he wanted to be part of whatever was about to happen. But there was no turning back now. His father was already moving forward. And with everything that had happened, Jeremy knew it was only a matter of time before the world found out what had really gone down that day. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was coming. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was for sure, it was going to be a lot harder than he thought. The next morning, the city buzzed with energy. It was the kind of morning where the sun shone brightly, the streets were filled with people rushing to work, and the usual hum of the city seemed louder than ever. But for Jeremy, everything felt different. The air was thicker, filled with tension, and every noise seemed to echo in his mind. He hadn't been able to sleep well the night before. The press conference weighed heavily on him. He knew that the moment he stepped into that room, everything would change. His father had already told him that the media would be there, that the city would be watching. And that knowledge had kept him up all night, his thoughts spiraling. Today was going to be the day the mayor addressed the incident that had happened with the homeowner, an incident that had already begun to stir controversy across the city. The press had picked up the story quickly, and it was now trending, the headlines flashing across screens everywhere. Black delivery driver harassed by white homeowner calls for justice. As Jeremy walked through the halls of his father's house, he could feel the eyes on him. It wasn't the usual calm morning he was used to. People were whispering, texting, and trying to gauge what his father would say at the press conference. The house had become a hub of activity as the mayor's staff prepared for the media frenzy. Jeremy didn't want to be part of it. He wanted to slip into the background, to fade into the crowd and leave the story behind. But that wasn't an option. Not now. Jeremy, his father's voice called out from the living room, interrupting his thoughts. He turned and saw his father standing at the door, looking more polished than usual. The mayor's demeanor was always confident, but today, Jeremy noticed something different. His father looked tired, older even, as if the weight of everything was pressing down on him. "Ready for the press conference?" his father asked, his voice calm but with a hint of strain. Jeremy hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Was he ready? Ready to stand there, in front of cameras, and let the world see what had happened? Ready to let the world judge his experience? "I guess," Jeremy said quietly, his voice betraying the uncertainty that was coursing through him. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," Mayor Williams said, stepping closer to him. "But it's important. You've been through something, and it's time to speak your truth." Jeremy swallowed hard. "I don't want to be the story. I just want to move on." His father's gaze softened. "I know. But sometimes, moving on means confronting the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. This situation isn't just about you. It's about the larger issue. We have an opportunity to start a conversation." Jeremy nodded, though he didn't feel ready for the conversation his father spoke of. He wanted to keep his life simple. He wanted to go back to his job, to his routine, to things that didn't involve press conferences or being scrutinized by the world. As they left the house, Jeremy couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation hanging over him. The mayor's SUV was parked in front of the house, ready to take them to the press conference. As they climbed into the car, the windows rolled up, blocking out the sounds of the city. The air inside the car felt thick, filled with the unspoken words between father and son. The drive to the city hall was a blur, the streets passing by in a mix of color and sound. Jeremy's mind was elsewhere, lost in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that this day was going to change everything for him. He didn't want to be part of his father's political world, but it seemed that the world was pulling him in whether he liked it or not. When they arrived at City Hall, the press was already gathered outside, cameras and microphones ready. Jeremy could hear the buzz of reporters and photographers, the flashes going off as people scrambled to get the perfect shot. He felt exposed, as if the whole world was watching, waiting for him to say something that could either make or break this moment. Mayor Williams stepped out of the car first, his usual confident stride in full display. But Jeremy noticed the tightness in his shoulders, the way his father kept glancing over his shoulder to make sure he was there. "Come on, Jeremy," his father said, extending his hand to him. "We've got this." Jeremy took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on him from every angle. The press conference was being held in a large auditorium, and as they walked through the doors, Jeremy could see the sea of reporters and cameras. His heart pounded in his chest as they made their way to the stage, where a podium awaited them. His father took his place at the podium, adjusting the microphone, and turning to face the crowd. Jeremy stood beside him, unsure of where to stand, unsure of what to do. He felt like a fish out of water. "Thank you everyone for coming today," Mayor Williams began, his voice strong and commanding as he addressed the room. "We're here to discuss an incident that occurred in our city, a troubling incident that has raised important questions about race, assumptions, and how we treat each other." Jeremy glanced around, seeing the faces of the reporters, their eyes fixed on his father, waiting for him to say something that would shed light on the situation. He wasn't sure what to expect. Was his father going to talk about the homeowner's actions? Was he going to use his influence to downplay it, to brush it under the rug? "As many of you know, my son Jeremy Williams was the victim of an unfortunate situation just a few days ago," Mayor Williams continued. "A situation in which he was harassed, wrongly accused, and made to feel like he didn't belong in his own community." The room was silent, all eyes on them now. "Jeremy," his father said, turning to him, "would you like to say a few words?" Jeremy froze. The last thing he wanted was to be the center of attention. But his father's eyes were on him, urging him to speak. He stepped up to the microphone, feeling every ounce of his body stiffen. The room was silent as he cleared his throat. I don't know what to say," Jeremy started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be treated like I don't belong. I was just doing my job, trying to make a living. But it's not just about me. It's about how people see me. How people see us. How we're judged before we even have a chance to show who we are." He paused, taking a deep breath. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he couldn't stop. "And I don't know if an apology is enough," Jeremy said, his voice gaining strength. "I don't know if anything can make it right. But what I do know is that this needs to stop. We can't keep living in a world where people are treated differently because of their skin color. It's not fair." The silence in the room was deafening. Jeremy could feel his heart racing as the words left his mouth. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment where his voice would be heard by the world. "Thank you, Jeremy," his father said, stepping forward and placing a hand on his shoulder. "I couldn't be more proud of you." The reporters in the room seemed to hold their breath for a moment, and then the questions began. But Jeremy wasn't paying attention to them anymore. He had said what he needed to say. As the press conference continued, Jeremy's mind raced. His father had talked about the need for change, about the bigger picture. But for Jeremy, it wasn't just about the political message. It was about him, about the reality of being black in a world that didn't always see him as just a person. As the conference came to a close and the reporters began to leave, Jeremy felt the weight of everything hit him all at once. He had said what he needed to say, but now what? Was anything really going to change? The world was still watching, and Jeremy had no idea what the future would hold. But for the first time, he felt like he had a voice, whether he liked it or not. The press conference had left Jeremy feeling drained. He had spoken his truth, but the world's reaction was beyond his control. Now, back in the quiet confines of his father's office, he found himself replaying every word he'd said, every moment of discomfort. The weight of what had happened felt heavier than ever. The room around him was pristine, orderly, a stark contrast to the swirling emotions in his mind. His father's office was designed for power, a polished mahogany desk, sleek furniture, framed awards on the walls. Everything about the space screamed success and authority, a constant reminder of his father's world, a world that often felt distant and foreign to Jeremy. The reporters had bombarded him with questions after the press conference. They had asked about the incident, about his feelings on the matter, and how he thought things should change. He hadn't been prepared for any of it. The words had come out of him before he could even think about them, and now they were out there for everyone to dissect. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. Jeremy glanced down at the screen and saw it was another message from Kyle. "Yo bro, you good? Saw the press conference. You nailed it." Jeremy stared at the text, unsure how to respond. "Did I?" he thought. "Did I really?" He typed back. "I don't know, man. It's all a blur." Before Kyle could reply, his father walked into the room, closing the door behind him. The look on his face was one of quiet pride, but also concern. "Jeremy," Mayor Williams said, his voice calm but firm, "you did a great job today. You spoke your truth, and that's all anyone can ask of you." "I don't know if it felt like that," Jeremy admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It just felt like I was thrown into it. Like I didn't have a choice." "You did have a choice," his father said, sitting across from him. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have walked away from the whole thing. But you didn't. You chose to stand up and be heard, and that's something most people never do." Jeremy glanced out of the window, the sun now beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the city. He felt conflicted. His father's words had some truth to them, but it didn't change the fact that the entire situation had left him feeling exposed. "I just don't know if it will make any difference," Jeremy said quietly. "You know? Even if I speak out, nothing really changes. People still look at me like I'm an outsider." His father studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp. "The fact that you're speaking out is the first step toward change. It's not going to happen overnight, but your voice is part of the movement. Every time we speak out, we chip away at the walls that divide us." Jeremy sighed, leaning back in his chair. "But what if they never listen? What if nothing changes?" "Change doesn't come from instant results," his father replied. "It's a slow process, Jeremy. But it's a process that starts with people like you. People who have the courage to say enough is enough." There was a pause, and then Jeremy's father stood up, walking to the window. "I know this is hard. I know it's not the life you imagined, but this is the reality we face. And sometimes, the only way forward is to face it head-on." Jeremy didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to make sense of everything that was happening. His father was right in some ways, but the truth was, Jeremy didn't want to be caught up in the politics of it all. He didn't want his life to be defined by a story of racism and injustice. "I just want things to go back to normal," Jeremy muttered, almost to himself. His father turned back to face him, his expression softening. "I know you do. But things have changed. Whether you want them to or not." There was a knock at the door, and before either of them could respond, the door opened. A member of the mayor's staff, a young woman named Carla, stepped inside, her face serious. "Mayor Williams, we've received a lot of media attention," Carla said, looking directly at Jeremy. "The story is spreading faster than we anticipated. There's already talk about protests, and some local groups are organizing rallies in support of Jeremy. It's gaining momentum." Jeremy's stomach twisted at the mention of protests. He wasn't ready for this. He had barely just started processing the incident himself, and now the story was becoming bigger than he could handle. "What do you mean, protests?" Mayor Williams asked, his voice tinged with concern. "It's the usual, sir," Carla said. "A mix of support and backlash. People are calling for justice, demanding change. Some groups want to march in the streets to raise awareness about racial injustice. But there are also those who are pushing back. They don't like the idea of a story like this gaining traction." Jeremy felt his heart race. This was all moving so fast. The pressure of it all was starting to build. "I didn't ask for any of this," he muttered, his voice strained. Carla turned to him, her face sympathetic. "I know. No one expected it to escalate like this, but your story has hit a nerve. People are paying attention." Mayor Williams turned back to his son, his gaze steady. "We'll handle this. We'll make sure you're safe, and we'll make sure your voice is heard. But you need to be prepared. This is only the beginning." Jeremy nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for what was to come. The protests, the media frenzy, the pressure to stand up and be a symbol of change, it was all too much. "Can I just take a minute?" Jeremy asked, his voice breaking. "I need some space to think." His father nodded, his expression softening. "Of course. Take all the time you need." As his father and Carla left the room, Jeremy sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of everything on his shoulders. The protests weren't just a story in the news anymore. They were a reality he couldn't escape. The fight for justice, the fight for change, it had become his fight, too. Jeremy ran his hands through his hair again, trying to steady his thoughts. What had he gotten himself into? The weight of the world seemed to be bearing down on him, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to carry it. But in the silence of the room, as the last rays of sunlight faded, he knew one thing for sure: the world was watching, and there was no turning back now. The days that followed the press conference were a blur of activity. News outlets, social media platforms, and local community groups all seemed to be buzzing with the aftermath. Jeremy had barely enough time to process one message before another was thrown at him, and with each passing day, the weight of the situation grew heavier. It wasn't just the press. It wasn't just the protests or the rallies that were starting to form. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface for so long had finally reached a boiling point, and Jeremy couldn't help but feel like he was caught in the middle of it all. The phone calls, the messages, the emails, it never stopped. Some were supportive, some were angry, and others were downright hostile. People either praised him for speaking out or criticized him for making a scene. It was hard to keep track of who was on his side and who wasn't. But perhaps the hardest part of all was the way people started to look at him. Every time he stepped out in public, he felt eyes on him. Some were sympathetic, others judgmental. And no matter how hard he tried to brush it off, he couldn't escape the feeling that everything had changed. It wasn't just the city or the community that was watching, it was the whole country. Jeremy found himself walking through the halls of his father's office more and more often, spending long hours there as the pressure continued to build. His father had insisted that he keep a low profile, stay out of the public eye as much as possible, but the media wouldn't let him. They had latched onto his story, turning him into a symbol for something bigger than himself. It was in one of those quiet moments, late one evening in his father's office, that Jeremy received a message that made his blood run cold. It was an anonymous email with no subject line, no signature, just a short sentence that made his heart drop into his stomach. "You don't belong here. Stay out of this city." Jeremy stared at the screen, his mind racing. He couldn't tell if it was a prank or a real threat. But the cold chill that spread through him told him it didn't matter. The message was clear. Whoever had sent it, they wanted him to know that he wasn't welcome. For the first time in days, Jeremy felt a wave of fear wash over him. The protests, the media attention, the constant scrutiny, it was all too much. And now this? A threat, lurking in his inbox, like a shadow waiting to catch him off guard. He didn't know who to turn to. His father had been busy, dealing with the fallout of the press conference and trying to manage the situation. The city was tense, and the division between those who supported him and those who didn't was growing wider every day. The weight of it all was suffocating. Jeremy took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in his mind. He couldn't let this anonymous message control him. He had to keep moving forward, even if he didn't know how. Just then, his phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Carla, his father's assistant. "There's a meeting tomorrow with some local community leaders. Your father wants you to be there. It's time to discuss the next steps." Jeremy read the message again, his stomach churning. A meeting. More discussions, more talking. More people who had opinions about his life, his actions, and his story. It wasn't just about a simple delivery anymore. It was about his identity, his place in the city, and how far he was willing to go to fight for justice. He typed a quick response. "I'll be there." But even as he sent the message, he wondered what he was really committing to. He had already said his piece. He had already spoken out. But what now? What did the future hold? Would speaking out make any difference? Or would it only put a bigger target on his back? The night passed in a haze of restless thoughts, and by the time the morning came, Jeremy was already exhausted. He didn't feel ready for the meeting with the community leaders, but he knew he had no choice. His father had made it clear that this was the next step. As he got dressed, Jeremy tried to push his fears aside. He couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Not when so many people were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. When he arrived at the meeting, he was greeted by a small group of local leaders, activists, and community members. His father was already there, seated at the head of the table, speaking quietly with a few people. When he saw Jeremy walk in, he gave him a reassuring smile, but there was something different in his eyes, something Jeremy couldn't quite place. "Jeremy, glad you could join us," his father said, gesturing for him to take a seat. Jeremy sat down next to his father, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. The room was filled with a mix of people, some who looked sympathetic, others who looked skeptical. The air was thick with tension, and Jeremy could feel the undercurrent of unspoken expectations. "We're here to discuss the next steps," Mayor Williams began, looking around the table at the group of leaders. "We've all seen what's been happening in the city. The protests, the rallies. It's clear that something needs to change. We need to figure out how we move forward together." One of the community leaders, a middle-aged woman named Angela, spoke up. "The conversation needs to be about accountability. About holding people like Mitchell, the homeowner, responsible for their actions. We can't let this go without making sure justice is served." Jeremy nodded, his mind still spinning. He wasn't sure where he fit into all of this. He had already spoken out. He had already shared his story. But now, with this group of people who had been fighting this battle for years, he realized just how little he truly understood about the depth of the issue. Angela turned to him, her gaze steady. "Jeremy, you've started something. But this isn't over. This is about more than just one incident. It's about systemic change. About making sure that people like you, people who are seen as outsiders, don't have to go through this again." The words hit Jeremy hard. He hadn't considered the bigger picture. He hadn't realized how deep the roots of this issue ran. It wasn't just about his delivery job, or his experience with that one homeowner. It was about a whole system that saw people like him as less than, as outsiders. His father spoke again, his voice steady and authoritative. "Jeremy and I have been talking about how we can take action. This is about more than just words. It's about tangible change. We have to look at the policies in this city, how they affect people of color, and work towards creating a more just system for everyone." The conversation continued, but Jeremy found it hard to keep up. His mind was racing. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was a call to action, and it was clear that his involvement wasn't just a matter of speaking out, it was about being part of a much larger movement. As the meeting came to an end, Jeremy felt both overwhelmed and strangely determined. He didn't know what the next steps were. He didn't know how to make a difference. But he knew one thing: this wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. And whether he liked it or not, he was now a part of it. He walked out of the room, his father by his side, and as they stepped into the hallway, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. But he also felt something else, a spark, a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in days, He felt like he might be able to face what was coming next. As they left the building, Jeremy's phone buzzed again. This time, it was another anonymous message. "We're watching. You won't get away with this." Jeremy stared at the screen, a chill running down his spine. It was a reminder that no matter how far he tried to run from the past, the shadow of racism and injustice would always be there, lurking just out of sight. But Jeremy wasn't going to run anymore. He couldn't. And as he stepped into the car, he realized that whatever happened next, he was ready to fight. The days after the meeting were even more intense than Jeremy could have imagined. His life, already turned upside down, had now entered uncharted territory. Every decision, every move he made seemed to be under scrutiny. He had spoken out, and now there was no turning back. The pressure of it all was building, but there was something else gnawing at him too, a strange feeling of purpose that he hadn't expected. The protests, which had begun as small gatherings of concerned citizens, were now growing by the day. What had started as a local issue was quickly gaining national attention. Social media campaigns were spreading the story of the delivery driver who had been harassed, drawing in activists, influencers, and everyday people alike who felt compelled to stand with him. It was becoming a movement, and Jeremy was at the center of it, whether he wanted to be or not. He had been receiving constant messages, some of support, others of hostility. The anonymous threats had continued as well, growing more frequent and increasingly menacing. But Jeremy was trying not to let that get to him. He had a job to do. The city was starting to take notice, and the mayor's office had already been in talks with local organizations about how to respond. His father was involved in every conversation, every negotiation, and Jeremy was learning more about the inner workings of the political world than he had ever wanted to. "Jeremy," his father's voice interrupted his thoughts as they sat in the mayor's office, papers scattered across the desk. "We've got another press briefing scheduled for this afternoon. I need you to be prepared for more questions, especially about the protests." Jeremy nodded, but his mind wasn't on the briefing. "I'm tired of talking," he admitted, his voice quiet but tinged with frustration. "I don't think it's helping. People are still angry. Nothing is changing." His father sighed, looking at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. I know it's hard. But your voice matters, Jeremy. These protests are a sign that people are listening, and that's a step forward." "I don't feel like we're moving forward," Jeremy muttered, running a hand through his hair. "It's like we're stuck, just talking about the same thing over and over. The same headlines, the same anger. When does it end?" "Change takes time," his father said, leaning forward. "Sometimes it feels like we're not getting anywhere, but we're laying the groundwork for something bigger. We've made an impact already, Jeremy. Your story has inspired people to stand up and demand justice. That's something." Jeremy didn't respond right away. He wanted to believe his father, but the doubts lingered in his mind. He was exhausted. He was tired of being part of a story he hadn't even asked to be a part of. He just wanted to live his life, to be normal, to go back to what it was like before that day when everything changed. But he knew deep down that there was no going back. Not anymore. As the press briefing approached, Jeremy tried to prepare himself, but it was hard to focus. The fear and anxiety from earlier threats had crept into his mind again, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving him. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, unsure who was sending the anonymous messages, or worse, who might be out there with worse intentions. The briefing itself went as expected. Questions about the protests, about the ongoing investigation into Mitchell, about the city's stance on racial inequality. His father was calm, composed, answering each question with ease. But Jeremy knew that no matter what his father said, it wouldn't be enough. The wounds were deep, and they couldn't be healed with words alone. After the briefing, Jeremy found himself wandering the halls of City Hall, his thoughts racing. He was struggling to find a sense of peace amidst the chaos. People were looking to him for answers, for leadership, but he didn't know how to lead. He was just a man, a delivery driver who had been caught in something far bigger than himself. "Jeremy," a voice called from behind him, breaking his thoughts. He turned to see Carla approaching, her expression serious. "Your dad's looking for you. There's something you need to see." Jeremy followed Carla down the hallway, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. She led him into a small office where his father was waiting, standing by a large screen that displayed a series of images. "We've just received these," his father said, pointing to the screen. "They were sent to us by a source in the city. We think they might be connected to the threats you've been receiving." Jeremy walked closer to the screen, his heart pounding. On the screen were a series of photos, shots of his home, his father's office, and several locations he frequented. There were even pictures of him walking out of City Hall, taken from angles that seemed too precise, too personal. The feeling of being watched was no longer just a paranoia, it was a reality. Jeremy's stomach dropped. Who would do this? We don't know yet, Mayor Williams said, his voice tight. But these kinds of photos are usually meant to send a message. Someone is trying to intimidate you. This isn't just about the protests anymore. Whoever is behind this is escalating. Jeremy stood frozen, staring at the photos. His mind was spinning, his fears becoming a terrifying reality. He had been threatened before, but this was different. Someone had been watching him, tracking his every move. Carla stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with urgency. We need to take this seriously, Jeremy. This isn't just about your safety anymore. This is about your family, too. We have to increase security around your house, your office, everywhere. Jeremy shook his head, his thoughts a whirlwind. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to do my job. Why is this happening? His father placed a hand on his shoulder. I know this is hard. But you're not alone in this, Jeremy. We're going to protect you. We'll find out who's behind this. The next few days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and increased security. Jeremy found himself constantly surrounded by bodyguards, private security, and the constant hum of media attention. His life had become a whirlwind of uncertainty, and no matter where he went, he felt trapped in a situation that was spiraling out of control. And then one evening, just as the sun was setting, Jeremy received a call from an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat. Hello, he answered, his voice shaky. Jeremy, we know who you are. We know what you've been doing. And it's time you stop. The voice on the other end was distorted, but it was unmistakable. It was the same voice from the threatening emails. Jeremy's blood ran cold. We're not going to let you get away with this. You'll regret ever stepping out of line. The line went dead before Jeremy could respond, leaving him standing in the middle of his living room, breathless, his body frozen in fear. The messages had always felt like distant threats, words on a screen. But now they felt real, too real. Whoever was behind them was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Jeremy knew deep down that the worst was yet to come. The following days felt like a blur of tension and fear. Jeremy's life, which had once been mundane and routine, had transformed into something out of a thriller. Every step he took, every phone call, every interaction was now overshadowed by the threat looming over him. The city had become a stage, and he was both the performer and the target. The phone call, the distorted voice, and the cryptic threats had left him shaken, but his father's response was immediate. Security was increased around his house, and a new team of experts was brought in to trace the source of the threats. But despite their efforts, the sense of danger lingered, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Jeremy could no longer go anywhere without feeling the eyes of the world on him, or more specifically, the eyes of someone who wanted to hurt him. Each time Jeremy left the house, there were security guards following closely, their presence a constant reminder that he was no longer just a delivery driver, he was a symbol, a target. The protests were still ongoing, and while the media had somewhat shifted its focus, the anger and division remained, festering beneath the surface. His father had continued to maintain his calm public persona, addressing the media with his usual authority, speaking about the need for change and unity. But at home, Jeremy could sense the weight his father carried, the pressure of the city's expectations, the demands of his position, and now the safety of his son. That night, after another long day filled with meetings, press briefings, and security updates, Jeremy sat alone in his father's office. The room, always meticulously organized, felt suffocating. The walls, lined with achievements and accolades, no longer gave him the comfort they once had. He was tired, physically, mentally, and emotionally drained. The sense of being hunted, of being constantly watched, was taking a toll on him. His phone buzzed again. Another message. We're watching you. Keep pushing, and we'll make sure it's your last mistake. It was from the same anonymous number, the same distorted voice that had haunted him for days. Jeremy dropped the phone on the desk, staring at it with a mixture of fear and anger. He couldn't keep living like this, unable to escape the grip of the shadows that clung to him. He knew he couldn't stop fighting, not with so much at stake. But every fiber of his being screamed for him to end this, to walk away and never look back. But walking away wasn't an option. He was already too far in. His father had made it clear that they couldn't back down, that his voice mattered in this fight. The protests weren't just for him, they were for everyone who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or made to feel like they didn't belong. The message had spread far and wide, and Jeremy's story had become more than just one man's experience. It had become a call for justice. Jeremy's phone rang again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his father. "Jeremy, are you at the office?" Mayor Williams asked, his voice tense. "Yeah," Jeremy replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just here, going through some stuff. You need to get out of there. Now," his father said urgently. "There's been a security breach at the building. We've just been notified, and it's not safe." Jeremy's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, not safe? What's going on?" "We don't have all the details yet," his father responded, his voice more serious than Jeremy had ever heard it. "But we have reason to believe someone has infiltrated the building. The threats, they've escalated. You need to leave now." Jeremy's mind raced. He stood up from his chair, his legs unsteady, as panic surged through him. His instincts told him to run, to get out of there immediately, but the fear gnawing at him was unlike anything he had ever felt. He grabbed his jacket and hurried to the door, his breath coming faster with every step. As he made his way down the hallway, he heard the sound of hurried footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of the security team, but instead, he saw someone who made his heart drop into his stomach, a man in a black hoodie, his face obscured by a mask. The man was coming toward him quickly, his movements calculated and precise. Jeremy's pulse raced as his mind struggled to process what was happening. Was this one of the people who had been sending the threats? Was it someone trying to intimidate him? The man lunged at him, grabbing him by the arm, pulling him into a nearby storage room. Jeremy fought back, adrenaline coursing through him, but the man's grip was strong. He tried to yell, to call for help, but the door slammed shut behind him, locking them both inside. The man pushed him to the ground, his breath heavy and labored. Jeremy could see the hatred in the stranger's eyes, and in that moment, he realized that this wasn't just some random act of violence. This was personal. Whoever this was, they wanted him silenced. They wanted him to stop speaking out. "Listen to me," the man growled, his voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed quiet. You should have stayed in your lane. You don't belong in this fight. And now, you're going to regret it." Jeremy struggled to free himself, but the man was stronger, pinning him down with each move. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He knew he needed to think, to fight back, but in that moment, everything felt blurry. "You don't get to decide what happens next," Jeremy spat, his voice full of defiance. "I'll speak out as long as I want. You can't stop me." The man's eyes flared with anger. "You think you're some kind of hero? Some symbol of change? You're nothing. Just a pawn in a game you don't even understand." Jeremy pushed with all his strength, knocking the man off balance for just a moment. It was enough time for him to scramble to his feet and run toward the door. He slammed his shoulder against the door, trying to break it open, but it was locked. Panic surged through him, and in that moment, he felt completely alone. Then a sudden burst of noise, footsteps, shouting, the sound of running, distracted him. The man's grip loosened for just a moment, and Jeremy took advantage of it, darting for the window. He didn't know if anyone outside could hear him, but he had no choice. He had to get out of there. He pushed the window open and climbed out onto the fire escape, his heart still racing. The sounds of footsteps chasing after him echoed in the building, but Jeremy didn't stop. He ran down the metal steps, his mind focused on one thing: escape. As he reached the ground, he heard a voice shout after him, "This isn't over." Jeremy didn't look back. He couldn't. The world was crashing down around him, but for the first time in days, he felt like he had control over something. He ran, ignoring the pain in his legs, ignoring the fear that screamed at him to stop. He didn't know what was waiting for him, but one thing was clear: the stakes had just been raised. And now, there was no turning back. Jeremy didn't stop running. He didn't even glance behind him to see if the man in the hoodie was still chasing him. His only focus was the steady rhythm of his feet pounding against the pavement, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. It felt like the world was closing in around him, each step he took further distancing him from whatever had just happened in the building, something he couldn't even fully process yet. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a group of people on the street. He didn't recognize any of them, but they seemed familiar somehow, perhaps because they were watching the city unfold just like he was. Jeremy barely spared them a glance, not wanting to stop for anyone, and yet, something held him back. A woman, her face weary from the stress of the past few weeks, caught his eye. She nodded toward him, a silent acknowledgement that didn't need words. Jeremy's mind raced. Was it possible she knew who he was? Did she know what he'd just gone through? Maybe. Or maybe it was the way he looked, his face a mix of fear and determination. The city had become a strange place for him, where the lines between public and private were blurred, where every face seemed to hold a story, a question, or a secret. He ducked into a side street, trying to lose himself in the maze of alleys. His breath was ragged now, his pulse hammering in his ears. The earlier adrenaline was wearing off, and fear was starting to creep back in. It wasn't just the physical pursuit, it was the psychological weight that was starting to settle in, the knowledge that someone out there wanted him silenced. He slowed his pace once he felt a little distance between himself and the building. His mind was still foggy, the events of the past hour replaying like a movie in slow motion. The man, the threats, the locked room, it all felt like a nightmare, like something that wasn't real. But it was real. Too real. And if anything, it was getting worse. Just as he reached the corner of another block, his phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration so sharp it startled him. He pulled it out quickly, his fingers shaking as he glanced at the screen. It was another message. From an unknown number. You can't hide forever. The price for your silence is coming. The next step won't be as easy. Jeremy's stomach dropped. He had barely escaped the building, barely outrun the danger, and now this. The words on the screen felt like a warning, a cold reminder that this wasn't going to end soon. Who are you? Jeremy typed back quickly, his fingers trembling. What do you want from me? The reply was almost immediate. You'll find out soon enough. You think your father can protect you? You're wrong. Jeremy stared at the phone for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The message was cryptic, but it was clear, whoever was behind these threats wasn't going to stop. Not until they got what they wanted. But what did they want? To silence him? To stop the movement he had become a part of? He didn't know the answer, but what he did know was that he couldn't face this alone anymore. It wasn't just about the protests, the press, or even the city's politics. This was something deeper. Something that could tear everything apart. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and then he made the decision. It was time to go home. Time to talk to his father. Time to confront whatever this was, face to face. As he walked back toward the mayor's office, Jeremy's mind was spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about one man's mistake. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the scale of what was happening. These threats weren't personal, they were part of something much bigger. The city was divided, and Jeremy had become the catalyst for something that had been simmering for years. When he reached the mayor's office, security was tighter than before. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that someone was watching him, following him. But he pushed the thoughts aside as he approached the door to his father's office. The guard at the front desk looked up at him, nodding silently. Jeremy entered the office to find his father and Carla deep in conversation. They both looked up when he stepped inside, their faces a mixture of surprise and concern. Jeremy, his father said, rising from behind his desk. You're here. Is everything okay? Jeremy swallowed hard. I don't know. I don't know if I'm okay. Someone tried to, he paused, his words caught in his throat. He didn't want to admit it, but he needed to. Someone tried to hurt me. I barely got away. His father's expression shifted immediately, his face hardening. What happened? He asked, his voice sharp. I was in the office. I was going over some things when a man attacked me. I managed to escape, but there are photos of me. My movements are being tracked. I'm not safe, Dad. And I don't think it's just about me anymore. Carla stepped forward, her face serious. Mayor, this is escalating. We can't ignore this anymore. We need to take stronger action. We need to find out who's behind this before it goes any further. I agree, his father said, his voice low and tense. Jeremy, you need to stay with me from now on. We're increasing security around you, and I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I won't let anyone hurt you. Jeremy shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. It's not just me. They're after all of us, Dad. Whoever's behind this doesn't just want me to shut up. They want to silence everything I stand for. The protests. The movement. The change we're trying to make. They want to make sure nothing changes. His father was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but with an edge of determination. Then we fight back. But we do it smart. We find out who's behind this, and we bring them to light. But for now, you're not going anywhere alone. Not until we know you're safe. Jeremy nodded, the weight of his father's words settling on him. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about standing tall and facing what was coming, no matter how dangerous it might be. As they spoke, there was a sudden knock on the door, breaking the tension. A staff member stepped in, her face grim. "Sir," she said to Mayor Williams, "we just received more information. It's not just an isolated case. There are other incidents. More threats. And it's all connected to the same group." Jeremy's blood ran cold. Whoever was behind this had a plan, and it was bigger than he had imagined. "We're dealing with something much darker than we thought," his father said quietly, his face set with resolve. Jeremy took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next, he wasn't going to run anymore. This fight had just become personal, the weight of the situation settled heavily on Jeremy's shoulders. Everything he had known before, the simple rhythm of his life, the routines, the jobs, the easy trips down familiar streets, had been swept away in an instant. Now, his life was a constant whirlwind of fear, uncertainty, and overwhelming responsibility. The stakes were higher than ever, and the shadows that had been lurking just beyond the edges of his world had finally reached out to pull him in. That night, as Jeremy sat in his father's office with Carla and the mayor, the full scope of what was happening began to come into sharper focus. The walls, once comforting with their polished grandeur, now felt like barriers. No one was beyond the reach of whatever forces were conspiring against him. "Jeremy, we've been going through everything we know about these threats," his father began, his voice steady despite the underlying tension. "There's something bigger at play here. It's not just random acts of violence, it's organized. Whoever's behind this has been working on it for months, maybe longer." Jeremy leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, organized? Who's behind this? Who are we up against?" "We're not sure yet," Carla interjected, her tone sharp, "but the pattern is clear. Every threat, every attack, every piece of intel we've gathered points to a group that wants to maintain the status quo. They're scared of the change that's happening, Jeremy. They want to keep things the way they've always been." Jeremy felt a chill run through him. The protests, the media coverage, the rallying cry for justice, it wasn't just stirring public opinion, it was making someone uncomfortable. Someone with enough power to orchestrate something this sinister. "We're dealing with people who have influence," Mayor Williams continued, his voice grim. "And not just in the local community. This is bigger than that. These people are tied to powerful interests who don't want the narrative to shift. They want to shut you down before the movement gets any more traction." "But why me?" Jeremy asked, his voice hoarse. "Why is it so important that I stay quiet?" "Because you're the face of this change," his father answered, his gaze unwavering. "You've become a symbol, Jeremy. You've inspired people to speak out, to demand justice. And that makes you a target. You can't back down now. You have a voice, and you have to use it." Jeremy felt the pressure mounting on him. His father was right. He had become something more than just a delivery driver. He had become a symbol of resistance, of everything the people in power feared. But the question still lingered in his mind. How could he fight an enemy that was so shadowy, so elusive? How could he stand against an organization that could reach into the highest offices, manipulate the media, and strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dared challenge them? Before he could voice his doubts, the door to the office opened, and another staff member entered, holding a file in her hands. "Sir," she said, addressing the mayor, "we've just received more information. It's from a confidential source. It's not much, but it might help." The staff member handed over the file, and Mayor Williams opened it quickly, scanning the contents. His expression hardened as he read. "This is it," he muttered. "We've got a lead." "Who is it?" Jeremy asked, his pulse quickening. Could this finally be the break they needed? "Someone from within the group," the mayor said, his voice low but filled with determination. "A whistleblower, someone who's had enough of what's been going on behind the scenes. They've given us names, locations, and even plans. This could be our chance to dismantle the operation." Jeremy felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in days. If this was real, if they could take down the people behind the threats, maybe there was a way out of this nightmare. But even as the thought crossed his mind, a dark cloud settled over him. The whistleblower had risked everything to come forward, and the people they were up against wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got in their way. Is it safe? Carla asked, her voice tense. We don't know who we can trust in this. If they've been operating this long without detection, there's no telling how many people are on their side, even within our own circles. Mayor Williams nodded grimly. We move carefully. We take every precaution. We have to be sure the information is real before we act. But this is our opportunity. Jeremy felt his hands grow clammy as his mind raced. The idea of facing off against this group, whoever they were, scared him more than he cared to admit. The stakes weren't just about him anymore. They were about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. Are we really doing this? Jeremy asked quietly. Are we going to expose them? We are, his father said, his voice firm, the weight of his words carrying the promise of a fight. You've already done the hard part, Jeremy. You've raised awareness. Now, it's time to take action. Jeremy looked around the room at the people who had gathered to help him, and despite the fear that clung to him, he felt a strange sense of resolve. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for the future, for the kind of world he wanted to live in. He had a responsibility to those who were fighting alongside him, to those who had suffered in silence for so long. Let's do it, Jeremy said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his chest. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning, strategy, and nervous anticipation. The mayor's office, along with the security team, worked tirelessly to verify the whistleblower's information. The names, the locations, the plans, it all checked out. But with each step closer they got to exposing the group, the more dangerous things became. They had to be careful, deliberate. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. Jeremy was given new instructions. He was to lay low, stay out of the public eye, and trust the team to handle the operation. But as the days passed, he grew restless. He wanted to be a part of the action. He couldn't sit idly by while this group continued to wreak havoc. His father sat him down one evening, the weight of the situation evident in his eyes. Jeremy, I need you to understand something. We're about to take a huge risk. Exposing these people means opening up everything they've been hiding, everything they've been building for years. We're not just exposing corruption, we're exposing a system that has allowed this to continue. I get it, Dad, Jeremy said, his voice tight with emotion. But I can't just sit back and watch. Not when it's about more than just me. His father looked at him, his expression softening for a moment. I know. But the best way to protect yourself right now is to stay out of the spotlight. We need to make sure this goes smoothly. Jeremy nodded reluctantly. He understood the risks. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the fight wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about changing the world. And he wasn't going to back down now. The final plan was set into motion, and as the day approached, Jeremy felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his chest. He was about to confront the most dangerous people he had ever encountered. But this time, he wasn't going to run. The city, the world, it was watching. And whatever happened next, Jeremy knew one thing: he had a chance to change it all.